That's weird. I dropped my pen and now I can't find it. Oh dear. Oh, there it is. All right. Whew. Heart attack. Okay. Alrighty, there we go. Okay, so today we're going to finish talking about labor markets. We got 2 slides left. Then we're going to go into a different unit. We're going to talk about youth and kind of their place in the labor market a little bit. So that's a quick unit. We should be able to get through that today and Monday, and then Wednesday, kind of do Q&A and something a little bit more relaxed as we prepare for midterm number 2. Okay, so first thing to say, I'm going to answer this question in a sec because it was last class. I think it's an interesting question. But I have to put up practice questions for you for the second midterm. I've been just completely swamped, but it is number 2 on my list of things to do today and tomorrow. So I probably, just to catch up, I'm probably coming into work on Saturday just to do a whole bunch of marking. So I'm going to do that. But before I get any marking done, I am going to put up a whole bunch of practice questions. And now that I kind of know where we're going to end, I should be able to get practice questions up for the entire midterm. So, and we'll talk about the second midterm more on Monday a little bit, and certainly Wednesday where we have review for it. Okay, and it's Friday in class, same as last time, and all of that fun stuff. Okay, so we're going to finish this up, and then we're going to go on to youth in the labor market and talk about that really, really briefly. All right, so this question, from an employee's perspective, is it more financially advantageous to job hop every few years or work towards internal promotion within your existing company? And mostly, it depends on what industry you're in, but in general, what kind of recruitment experts will tell you is that often by staying in one place and not at least kind of having your resume out there and like semi-actively job hunting, you might be taking, somewhere between a 10 and 25% discount in terms of your wages compared to what might be on the market, right? That you might actually be worth, between 10 and 25% more, or I guess you're giving a discount on your wages, because often your wages within companies, especially small to medium businesses, are going to rise much more slowly than what people are recruiting for on the open market. So generally speaking, your best bet is maybe not to jump around, but at least to keep yourself semi-actively searching, so that you can then go back and kind of at least, hey, this place is offering me this much. Would you match that offer if you like where you're working, right? You can, use it to leverage against your existing employer. Okay. It's going to be, I don't remember exactly what we've talked about. So I think it's Canadian employment trends, labor markets, and youth in the labor market, I think, but there might be one other one. I'm trying to remember what else is covered on the midterm, and I am blanking, but I feel like we did one more thing. Hang on. I can tell you really quickly so that if you want to get started studying over the weekend. I mean, basically it's everything from the first midterm to the end of Monday's class, wherever that ends up. But I will give you my... Yeah, so, Canadian employment trends, job quality, labor markets, and youth in the labor market. That's what we're going to talk about. So, good times. I forgot job quality. All right. So, we ended off on this slide. We're talking about, incomes, labor, and things going on in the labor market, and how, essentially the top 10% of earners have seen their wages rise consistently, while, everybody else has more or less seen wages stagnate, especially compared to the cost of living. Okay, and going into our next unit, this is kind of a good transition in general. There's a clear generational divide in the labor market, with older generations doing much better. Typically, that's been the boomers and Gen X, with millennials and Gen Z lagging a little bit behind. Millennials are starting to make up that ground now, but it's taken millennials a lot longer to get to the same place as earlier generations. So if we talk relative earning power, right, it's been dropping over the decades, and especially when you compare to things like the cost of housing and the cost of food, we've seen kind of genuine declines in a whole bunch of these markers for younger generations. Women are doing slightly better, if we compare to where women in the baby boom generation and Gen X were, but they started from a lower point. So the fact that they've risen almost to parity with men in most cases, it means that they're doing better than older generations, but they're still behind in the labor market overall. And yeah, it's our older workers that have tended to weather the storm of globalization a bit better, with younger workers more exposed as the industries they might want to work in, fundamentally disappear. Those jobs are never created. And as older workers retire, a lot of stuff is just outsourced. And our working poor are a growing part of the Canadian labor market, especially if we include in the working poor, people like temporary foreign workers, who are often paid, very bare minimum wages, charged extra fees. Often people are paying to come work in Canada, as a way of hopefully, getting permanent residency, bringing relatives over, or sending money back home. So when we include temporary foreign workers, we see a big chunk of the Canadian workforce being stuck as working poor. Okay, so what are our responses to labor market policy responses that governments tend to come up with to labor market barriers? You kind of hear it all the time, right? The thing that's pushed in terms of trying to get people to better spots in the labor market, and there's nothing wrong with this, is always to push post-secondary education, right? And this is a central policy goal. One of the goals, for a couple generations has been to move as many people into some kind of post-secondary education, particularly university, as possible. Now, this does have some negative effects at times, where you get things like educational inflation. More people have degrees, so degrees are worth less. Other things, right, along with that, right, this comes with rising educational costs, simple supply-demand kind of equation. As there is more demand, the cost is going to go up, right? And especially if supply remains relatively unchanged. Okay, Other things, that are recommended: skills and upgrading for older and unemployed workers, right? Getting people into retraining programs. In Canada, this has always been very spotty in terms of its how diligent governments are about it and how successful it is. It's a great idea in principle, but it's very, often people are left to bear the burden of the costs of, upgrading or retraining by themselves with not a lot of assistance. Sometimes, employers will do formal training in the workplace, build skills into existing employees. However, again, this is often not done very consistently, simply because employers would rather the government pay for it, right? To send someone to NAIT or, a community college or some kind of retraining program than them having to pay to do it internally. Okay. Investment in human capital is, again, only part of the problem. If there are no good jobs for people to do, right? If you have a stagnating economy like Canada has for the better part of a decade at this point, it's going to be hard for people to find these good jobs if they just don't exist. Underemployment, people with as a receptionist in a dental office, and one of the best students I ever had, super bright, but after she graduated with a sociology psych degree, could not find work, and she ended up working as basically the receptionist in a dental office, right? That would be 82% of people find work, but she was definitely underemployed. She went back, did her ed degree. She's doing great now, but the 2-year B.Ed after degree, doing great now, but definitely struggled in some ways. We talked a little bit, when we talked about people who are disabled, when we talked Canadian employment trends, right? Under disadvantaged groups, especially people who are disabled, right, often face a lot of discrimination. And unions, right, would be good. Right, if we could get rid of that, that would really help those populations. Unions would be really good, but rates of unionization in Canada and the US have actually dropped significantly over time, especially private sector, right? Private sector unions, their employment in private sector, in industries with private sector unions is declining over time. Okay. Are stay-at-home moms considered unemployed or employed? No, they are not considered employed, but they're also not considered unemployed. That's actually a good question. No, they are not actually considered employed or unemployed. They're simply not counted as part of the labor force at all. So, so people who are involved in childcare or, unemployment excludes. Yeah, so it excludes people performing unpaid work in the home. So, you're not considered part of the labor force. And you're just like not active in the labor force. If you are doing childcare at home, right, that's not an active part of the labor force. You're also not counted as unemployed. You just don't exist in government numbers. I think that answers that question. Cool. Okay. I'm going to transition now to a different slideshow. Enjoy Chartres Cathedral in France for a moment while I find my slides. Okay. Sorry, I just have to switch one thing here. Okay. I think this is the same slideshow as before, so questions should appear. You shouldn't have to change Slidos. I've been working on that. Okay, so when we talk about youth in the labor force, right, there's a whole bunch of kind of different things we can say, and I guess maybe I got these a little bit out of order. Let me go, I'll go over to here, and then I'll go back to that slide I was on a second ago. When we talk about youth employment, right, one of the things that's generally true about younger workers is they are the ones that are most affected during kind of economic disruptions, right? So we talk about aggregate economic conditions, right? So the overall, we mean the overall health, right? The health of the economy. So when the economy is healthy and growing, doing well, young people do well, right? This is the kind of basic calculus. However, whatever the aggregate conditions in the economy are, if the economy goes into recession, young workers are going to be the ones that feel it the most, right? For a number of reasons. But among those reasons, right, often they're the last hired. So in layoffs, they're often the first ones to get laid off. Now, there are exceptions to this, right, where sometimes companies will try to lay off older workers who get higher salaries in order to replace them with cheaper workers. My wife's uncle, who was like a high-level accountant in Calgary, I still don't know exactly how you come to be a high-level accountant, but he's a high-level accountant, making a pretty solid six-figure salary at a big oil firm. And basically in the 2015 kind of recession, when oil prices went down, he got laid off. And by his account, he was replaced by 3 younger accountants, that were still cheaper than him, than what he was getting as a salary. So one can presume, and given their house, that his salary was quite a lot. Apparently, being an accountant pays pretty well. Actually, I know a lot of accountants. It does pay pretty well. So usually this is the case, right? But there are exceptions where sometimes it's good for younger workers in limited degrees. Okay, companies though, when it comes to layoffs, what are they going to prioritize? Typically experience, connections, and competence, right? And there's no quality like experience when it comes to a lot of field. And this is also why, my father-in-law, who just turned 73, has had a really hard time retiring. He's an oil field engineer or a petroleum engineer of some kind. And, all of these people that he used to work with keep coming to him to see if he'll consult, just for 6 months, Bruce, just for 6 months. Because he has a ton of experience, right? He knows, everything going on in the field, and he's been doing it forever. So companies like to keep their most experienced workers, because they have the kind of best rounded skills. They're the most competent, and they're also really well connected, right? Older workers tend to have better social capital in the industries they're working in. So they're often considered sort of invaluable. So you'll lay off younger workers and often download more responsibilities onto your older, more experienced workers. And then the obvious ones, right? There's just less hiring during economic downswings because there's no economic activity, right? You're not going to hire people to do nothing, right? And even, unpaid internships paid and unpaid internships tend to decline during economic downturns. And I remember my one friend, he's an engineer, but he's really more of a business guy. I think he got his engineering degree as his first degree towards his MBA, because what he really wanted to do was be a bigwig. And he transitioned from being a chemical engineer. He's now a developer. But the first company he bought was an engineering company. And one of the things I remember he said, I used to have him come lecture in this class, but then I'm like, you're not really an engineer anymore. I'm like, what's the last thing you stamped? And he's like, can't remember? Okay, you're not an engineer anymore. Anyway, he used to have co-op students, right, which are basically interns in the company. And then when 2015 hit, right, there's a company that did a lot of oil and gas work. When 2015 hit, oil price declined, he stopped taking co-op students because he had nothing for them to do, right? It was basically, he was scraping the bottom of the barrel to keep his more experienced employees employed. And so when U of A came and like, hey, would you like a co-op student? He's like, I don't have anything for them to do, right? It's a nice idea. But so even getting the experience of an internship for younger workers starts to get harder when you get these aggregate swings in the economy. Okay, so there's one more slide. I think my slides are a little out of order. I don't know why. Okay, I may have taken a slide out. Never mind. I looked at them this morning and I thought it was there. Okay. All right, so when we talk about a catch-22, right? So you know what a catch-22 is, right? Basically, a catch-22 is something where no matter what you do, you're kind of screwed, right? That there's always sort of a negative built into the system that's going to give you some trouble. And when it comes to youth labor markets, there's a bunch of different ways globally that youth labor markets are labor markets are structured in ways that either advantage or disadvantage young workers in particular ways. So, if we talk about countries like Canada, the US, and the UK, right? When we talk about them, what we can say is that youth employment is better than it is in a lot of other parts of the world. And I think I've said before in this class, so if we take our, US, Canada, and the UK, the rate of youth unemployment is 2 times the average, right? Roughly 2 times average. So that's considered relatively good. Now, the system that we have in Canada, the US, and the UK is what we call at-will employment, right? And basically, you're hired at the will of your employer, and you can be terminated. That looks like cat will. I'm going to put an arrow on that because that's not right. At will employment. Cat will would be different. At will employment, right? Which means you work at the will of your employer. So what does an at will system look like? Well, generally speaking, in an at will system, it's relatively easy to fire someone, right? So Canada, the US, and the UK tend to have employment systems that favor employers. And particularly, they favor flexibility on the part of employers. So it's all, when the system is designed essentially to make it easy for employers to hire people and fire people to adjust themselves to economic conditions. So amongst these things, I'm sure if you've ever held a job in Alberta, right, you'll know this. There is, a 90-day trial period for new employees, right? And in that 90 days, you can be fired without cause, right? They don't have to tell you for 90 days. They could just be like, yeah, I don't think you're working out. Goodbye, right? Right up until the end of day 90. They can let you go with no compensation, no nothing, no notice, all that fun stuff. And I will say, even, afterwards in these systems, the bar for dismissal is pretty low. Even after 90 days, they have to give you cause. But unless you're willing to actually go to court and fight it out with an employer that's let you go, there's not a lot of labor protections for workers. And I'll give you an example. My sister, she used to work for a company called Leadcore, right? And, Leadcore is a big construction company. They do stuff all over North America. They're pretty massive. And she was working in one of their mod yards, kind of just south of the city. And she was working an average of 62 hours a week, right? And she'd been doing this for about 10 months. She'd been at Leadcore for a long time, but she and one of the vice presidents in charge of this mod yard did not get along. And so, working an average of 62 hours a week, she was laid off. And on the pink slip, the reason for the layoff was lack of work, right? Which is one of the reasons that you can be laid off, right? If a company doesn't have any work for you, you get a pink slip, you could get EI, the reason being lack of work. Now, I think, you would be as surprised as she was working 60 hours a week to discover that somehow you lacked work, right? But the only way that she could have actually, contested this and gotten some sort of wrongful dismissal compensation would have been to file a lawsuit in civil court against the company saying, that obviously this was bullshit, right? And she was just like, whatever, I'm just going to go find another job, which she did, in relatively short order. And so, the employer kind of got away with it. So the proof, of wrongful dismissal in at-will systems is on the back of the employee. The employee has to prove wrongful dismissal, not the employer has to prove that the dismissal was justified. So you have to take it to court. So what does this mean, right? Typically pretty low job security for young people. However, let me grab my eraser here. There are some benefits to this system as well. For one, probably would have been faster just to erase everything on the slide. That flexibility leaves employers in a position where they tend to be more willing to accept risk. Because we might not think about it, when because we all think we're wonderful people and we're going to be a great employee. But when your employer hires you, they're fundamentally taking a risk, right? They're risking that you are not going to match what's on your resume, that you're not going to have the skills, the competencies, the personality. You're not going to get along with the other people who work there, that maybe you're going to be a problem employee, right? Problem employees do exist. So they are taking a pretty substantial risk on you by hiring you. Now, things like this 90-day trial period mitigate that risk, right? Because if you're not working out, hopefully after 3 months, people can figure it out. And the kind of laxness of the dismissal system makes it pretty easy to let people go who aren't working out, who you don't get along with, right? And all of that fun stuff. So it mitigates risk pretty substantially. Now, what does that mean for young people? Well, it's more likely that an employer is going to take a risk on you because that risk is fairly minimal, right? They have 90 days to get rid of you if you're not working out. Other places in the world, and this is typical of the EU, and if we think of our big EU economies, right, we think of Germany and France, but certainly other countries like the Netherlands, fit this bill as well. And what can we say about these places? Well, they tend to have much less flexible labor laws, right? And it's very difficult to fire someone once they have been hired. France is a particularly egregious example of this. In France, there's a whole bunch of weird aspects of the labor market. For one, if you work in an industry that has a union in it, right? Whether you are a part of a union or not, maybe in Canada and places we have union shops, we have non-union shops. They have the same thing in France. But let's say you work, in an industry that's unionized, but you're not part of that union. So any part of this industry is unionized. Everybody gets the same benefits of the unionized employees, right? So things like, it's really difficult to fire someone once they have been hired. There's no waiting period, right? There's no test period at all. And so basically, once someone has been hired, you need to, provide cause for them to be fired. Whether they've been there an hour or 10 days, right? It's all the same. And so what has happened in these systems is young people have had much more difficulty finding work. Spain is a particularly egregious example of this. Youth unemployment today, I think in Spain, sits about 25%. It's gone as high as almost 60, at times, especially back in the late 2000s, early 2010s, right? It was something like 60%. And if you look at places like Italy, Greece, I'm trying to think, Portugal's the other one, right? They've seen consistently really, really high rates of youth unemployment. And part of this is the whole system is so inflexible. So if you're a young person and you happen to get a job, you're really lucky because you're going to keep that job. But because young people are seen as less reliable, there's such a risk for the employer, they tend to be less likely to hire younger people. They're looking typically for more experienced workers, more mature workers, people that are less risk, right? Now, the fact that, youth unemployment is so high and remains really high kind of perpetually makes it really hard for young people then to launch into adult life, right? To move out of their parents' house, to get their own space, to marry, to have children, right? To do all of those things that would set them as kind of, more mature, more grounded, better workers. So you have a sort of cultural lag that happens in a lot of European countries. Okay, I think that'll make sense. Okay. I'm just making sure there's no questions. So I feel like this at times is like my spirit animal. Old man yells at cloud. I don't know why. So especially today for some reason. So when we talk about young workers, now this term, entitled, right? Young people really since, I would say, the late 90s, early 2000s, younger workers, one of the labels that's been attached to younger workers by older workers has been, that they are entitled, right? So I think this was especially true with the millennials. And increasingly, I think it's true of Gen Z as well. People think of them as entitled workers. Okay, so why? Well, there's a sort of generational gap between the values of older and younger workers. And we talked about this a little bit earlier in the course. When we think of like the boomers and Gen X, and I mean, I've seen some great YouTube videos, asking Gen Xers about millennials and Gen Z. And it's always really funny because you can kind of perceive that generation gap in the commentary they give. Young people are often perceived as lazy. And specifically what it often comes down to is this idea, that they want these kind of things, that they want something for nothing, right? That from the moment they enter into the workforce, they have a set of values that says, they want good hours, right? They want good work conditions, relative autonomy, good wages, and they don't want to climb the ladder, right? And this comes, often as a kind of cultural disagreement between younger and older workers. Older workers, came up in a time where that was sort of the cultural expectation, that you would work really, really hard when you were young, climb the ladder and enjoy your success, much later in life. But especially with the millennials, right? The millennials were the ones that brought this term into the workforce, work-life balance, right? What do millennials want? They want work-life balance. And you see this amongst Gen Z as well, right? They don't want to climb the corporate ladder. They actually, want some kind of balance from the beginning, and that's important to them. So this often leads to them being seen as entitled, right? They don't want to do what past generations did. They're perceived as seeming like they're entitled to all the benefits of years of labor without having actually put in the work. Now, this position in a lot of ways has very little merit. Younger workers tend to be willing to work hard with the right incentive structures. It's just that the incentive structures that other generations sort of expect are not things that resonate with younger workers. And we talk about younger workers, right? And we talked about this in the last section. If we look at their wages, right? Compare, like if you took purchasing power, right? You looked at kind of purchasing power parity. So what could you buy with your wages in, let's say, I don't want to go too far back. Let's say 1970, right? Young person coming out of school gets a job. What could they buy with their wages compared to what a young person can expect to buy today? It's a lot less, right? Considerably less purchasing power today for young workers than workers in the past. So in a lot of senses, right, I guess, why kill yourself working so hard when your ability to sort of benefit from it economically is somewhat diminished? Okay. Some changes in kind of overall patterns of employment. One of the things that we see, in terms of the employment of young people is that overall, fewer young people are working today than in the past, right? So only 18% of Gen Zers in the 15 to 17 cohort were employed as of 2018, right? And this is compared to, 27% of millennials when they were about this, about the same time in their kind of generational kind of journey, right? So 2002, 27% of millennials and 41% of Gen Xers in 1986. So from Gen X to millennials to Gen Z, we've seen general downward trends in the percentage of them that work, right? And this holds amongst young adults, though it's not as extreme, right? When we look at our 18 to 22 cohort, right? So all of these people being in school in some sense. A little bit under 2/3 of our Gen Z cohort was working in 2018 compared to 71% of millennials in 2002 and 79% of Gen Xers in 1986, right? So general employment trends for young people declining over time. So the patterns of employment. There's kind of two stories here. There's one story which would be our blue-collar workers, right? And that's manufacturing, agriculture, resource extraction, and construction. And then our white collar, which is going to be your, service sector. And especially things like, teaching, education, engineering, computer programming, all those kind of high status professions, healthcare, all that stuff. Okay, so we got two sort of separate stories in what's kind of happened in terms of how people progressed through the labor market, typically based on kind of generational cohorts. So if we talk, prior to kind of the 70s and 80s, right? So let's talk about our period. Maybe I'll switch to a color you can see a little better. Let's go with orange. Yeah, okay. Let's talk about our period, let's say 1945 to about 1975, right? So the kind of normal way that people went through kind of the life course, right? For blue-collar workers, you graduated from high school, right? You got your high school diploma. And from there, you transitioned very quickly into work. Often, you went straight to, a manufacturing job, right? So you went down to the factory that was in wherever you lived, right? You lived in Windsor, you went down to the Ford factory, you got a job from Jim, the Ford foreman, and they trained you on the job to jump in and build cars for Ford, right? Maybe you started in the parts room, distributing spark plugs or some stuff like that, whatever it happens to be, right? But that's kind of where you went. Or maybe you went to like a 2-year technical school, and then you quickly transitioned into something like construction, resource extraction, or something like this, right? So this was a pretty normal story for blue-collar workers. Very, very short period of education, comparatively, and very quick turnaround into, good paying jobs. Those jobs paid well, right? They were good paying jobs with great benefits. A lot of them, like if you look at the auto sector, they had pensions, right? They had benefits, they had vacations. It allowed people to go off and marry their high school sweetheart, buy a house in the suburbs, right, with the stereotypical white picket fence, have a bunch of kids, and support those kids very well with very little kind of education and training. So that was a pretty normal pattern. Now, that changes in the mid-70s to 1980s. So a bunch of things happen. For one, you get a big economic... So, okay, let me slow down. One of the things that happens is that by the 1970s, the post-war reconstruction of Europe and Japan are basically done, right? It took a long time to recover from the Second World War, but by the 1970s, Europe and Japan are back, essentially, as Western Europe, I guess, as major economic powers, right? In this period, 45 to 75, the US and Canada, in a lot of ways, having been the only economies not really damaged by the war, right? Nobody bombed factories in Michigan the way they bombed factories in Manchester or Dresden or whatever. They were kind of whole, and they were providing goods not only for their own people, transitioning war industries into civilian industries, but also, getting major dividends from the reconstruction of Europe and Japan, providing products and services and all sorts of things. But by the 70s, these economies are back, right? So those markets thin out for Americans and Canadians. There's not as much demand. They're producing their own goods again. And in major ways, both of them start to compete back into the North American market with their own goods, right? And this is really most notable in automotives, right? And in automotives, right, you get companies like Volkswagen and, well, we'll talk about Toyota, but Honda to an extent as well, that come into the market and really kind of push the American car makers. And one of the things that auto manufacturing was one of the biggest manufacturing sectors in North America, and the American auto manufacturers really struggle. Why? Because they make really shitty cars, right? At this time, they in the 70s, 60s and 70s, one of the things they were focused on was these big gas guzzling muscle cars, right? I mean, so if you think of like the iconic cars of the American auto industry, a lot of them are from the 60s and 70s, right? I think of, a couple that are still with us, like the Mustang, right? 68 is the first year for the Mustang. It is a big gas guzzling monster of a car. And then what happens in 1973, you get oil embargoes. Because the Arab countries, OPEC, are angry at the US for supporting Israel in its various wars with Arab powers. And so they cut production and the price of oil skyrockets. And suddenly your Ford Mustang that, drinks a dinosaur per hour isn't quite so appealing. And these companies come in and they're offering small cars with efficient engines that burn very little gas. Plus, especially in the case of Toyota, they're really, really, really reliable, right? These things do not break very easily. They're quite well built. We'll talk about Japanese management later in the course, I hope, and how Toyota managed this, because it's a really interesting story on its own. They have a very unique management style. I just spilled coffee on my hand. It's Friday. All right. Anyway, a very interesting management style, but all of this makes it really, really difficult for our blue-collar workers. That life plan where you got to really quickly transition starts to get more complicated, right? It's harder to get those jobs. The American car industry starts its long decline, which is not done yet, but it's continuing on over time. And, it's just not as easy to get these kinds of good-paying jobs. And where do they end up going? Well, more and more of them end up in the lower tiers of the service industry. Okay, so that's how am I doing for time? I can probably do the rest of this in 7 minutes. So that's our story of our working class, or our blue collar, right? Our white collar, I'm gonna put white here because I realized WC could also be working class and I don't want to confuse you, white collar. So we think about people who end up in white-collar industries, right? More service industries, less physically demanding, clerical teaching, nursing, social work, administration, these sorts of things. There's a particular kind of pathway that people went through here as well. So, one more thing I should say, because I just saw this on my chart. With our blue-collar, automation plays a big role as well, right? In order to compete better with Japanese automakers, there's increasing pushes to automate more of the process, especially those dangerous, dirty jobs, right? Which is good, but it also takes away some jobs from people that were low-skilled but dangerous and dirty. Okay, back to our white collar. So where did you go, right? If you were a university graduate and you needed experience, a lot of times, what was really open to people was a lot of jobs in the public service, right? And the period, again, this period of 1945 to 1975 is a period in which the state, and especially what we would call the welfare state, expands tremendously, right? So you get a bunch of social programs. A lot of them are still with us, right? Employment insurance, in Canada, publicly funded medicine, public schools, right? All sorts of government, and just a lot of bureaucracy that grows up, and the government hires a lot of people to run these complex systems, and the size of the welfare state gets bigger and bigger. But what happens with this 70s kind of crisis? So there's a bunch of stuff going on. I don't want to get bogged down in explaining everything. The economic history of the period is extremely interesting. But among other things, in this whole period, one of the key economists, right, the one that everyone's listening to in terms of theories, is Keynes. Sort of. They take the Keynesian part of like building a welfare state that can, help people endure the downturns in the economy really seriously, but not the debt repayment part in good times. So governments in this period, what they do is they amass debt. Tons of it, right? In terms of their percentages of GDP, debt gets really difficult to manage. And so what happens in the end of the 1970s going into the 1980s, and especially, I've run out of places to write on my slide, so I'm going to erase everything. What happened, in the 1980s, you get the arrival of a couple of figures, Reagan in the US, Thatcher in the UK, and just a touch later, Mulroney in Canada. So Thatcher's in the UK, Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady. And what they do is all of them start to pare down the welfare state, right? They realize that they can no longer afford, the size of the welfare state, all of the programs. They do this in different ways. Like for instance, in the UK, one of the things that Thatcher does is she privatizes a lot of government industries. So British Rails, which used to be all publicly owned, transitions to a privately owned corporation. Some of this is done in wonky ways, like they sell the trains to one company and the rails to another company. And the company that owns the rails ends up making a ton of money because they rent rail time to everyone with trains. And that turns out to be massively profitable because you don't have to fix rails very much. But that's neither here nor there. So they pared down the size of government. And so this path where people went often, into health, education, or public service bureaucracies who were white collar, a lot of those career paths dry up as well. So a lot of people who have university degrees end up starting, their careers down in the service sector as well, and lower tiers of the service sector where you don't have good benefits, right? You have, sales, service, clerical, where you have poor wages, poor benefits, a lot of job churn and transition. Typically, right, these are medium-sized businesses. This is our secondary part of the labor market or our peripheral part of the labor market, and often little room for advancement. So the pathway for both kind of working class or blue-collar and white-collar workers shifts from really having good jobs available to them with great benefits, pensions, and all that jazz, to increasingly lower tiers in the service industry. And why don't we leave it there, because I only got 1 minute, and we'll pick it up on Monday. And we should be, I think I got 8 slides left here. We should be more than able to finish this off on Monday. Yeah, 8 slides left, including some question slides. We'll finish this off on Monday, and we'll go from there. Have a great weekend, everybody. Yes.
So it's including everything in midterm 1 and all the topics as
No,
well?
no, just what we did from midterm 1. So it's not cumulative.
Okay.
So it is, so it's labor market, good jobs, Canadian employment trends, and youth in the labor market only, but none of the stuff from midterm 1.
Okay, then I'll know better with the paragraphs.
Perfect.
Oh, nice one, hi, sure.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Marquons les jeux.